So, hello and welcome back yet again. We are back with Dear Miss Beverly of Graustark, who actually should be called Dear Miss Beverly of Washington, D.C., I guess, since that seems to be her most recent home. But I can't remember where she was from in the South, but she is definitely a Southern belle. Maybe a prototype Southern belle. I don't know if Southern belle was considered a type back in the early 1900s. I feel like it probably was. But yes, she and her raggedy band, who seemed to be mistaking her for the Princess of Graustark, are almost to their destination of Ganlook, where I feel like when she gets there, she's going to have some explaining to do. Because somehow I doubt if the like court officials are going to believe that she is their princess when presumably she doesn't look anything like Princess Yetiv. But more pressing matters are happening right now because Baldos took a bullet and some claws and seems to be running some sort of a wound fever or something, or at least that's what Beverly thinks. So we left them with Beverly demanding that they head immediately to a hospital because I guess moss and cobwebs are not actually penicillin. Who would have thought it? Anyway, and that is kind of where we left off. So we are going to be jumping back in to chapter 8 of Beverly of Graustark by George Barr McCutcheon. I was like, why did I want to call him General something? By George Barr McCutcheon. And we are going to be reading chapter 8, Through the Ganlook Gates. By this time, they were passing the queer little huts that marked the outskirts of a habitable community. These were the homes of shepherds, hunters, and others whose vocations related especially to the mountains. Further on, there were signs of farming interests. The homes became more numerous and more pretentious in their appearance. The rock-lined gorge broadened into a fertile valley. The road was smooth and level, a condition which afforded relief to the poor travelers. Ravone had once again dressed the wounds inflicted by the lion, but he was unable to provide anything to subdue the fever. Baldos was undeniably ill. Beverly, between her exclamations of joy and relief at being in sight of Ganlook, was profuse in her expressions of concern for the hero of the Hawk and Raven. The feverish gleam in his dark eyes and the pain that marked his face touched her deeply. Suffering softened his lean, sun-browned features, obliterating the mocking lines that had impressed her so unfavorably at the outset of their acquaintanceship. She was saying to herself that he was handsome after a most unusual cast. It was quite just the unforgettable face. "Your Highness," he said earnestly, after she had looked long and anxiously at his half-closed eyes, "we are within an hour of Ganlook. It will be dark before we reach the gates. I know that, but you have nothing to fear during the rest of the trip. Franz shall drive you to the sentry post and turn over the horses to your own men. My friends and I must leave you at the end of the mountain road. We are—" "Ridiculous!" she cried. "I'll not permit it. You must go to a hospital." "If I enter the Ganlook Gates, it will be the same as entering the gates of death," he said. "Oh, nonsense," she told him. "You have a fever or you wouldn't be talking like that. I can promise you absolute security." "You do not understand, Your Highness." "Nevertheless, you're going to a hospital," she told him. "You would die out here in the wilds, so what are your odds either way? Aunt Fanny, will you please be careful? Don't you know that the least little movement of the bags hurts him? Please, do not mind me, Your Highness. I'm quite well, he said with a smile. The coach brought up in front of a roadside inn. While some of the men were watering the horses, others gathered around the open window. A conversation in a tongue that was utterly incomprehensible to Beverly took place between Baldos and his followers. The latter seemed to be disturbed about something, and there was no mistaking the solicitous air in which they regarded their leader. The pseudo-princess was patient as long as possible, and then she broke into the discussion. "What do they want?" she demanded in English. "They are asking for instructions." "Well, you just instruct them to do as I bid," she said. "Tell them to hurry along and get you a doctor, and that's that." Evidently, Baldos's friends were of the same opinion, for after a long amount of talk, in which he was stubborn to the very end, they left the carriage and he sank back with a groan of dejection. "What is it?" she anxiously demanded. "They also insist that I go to a surgeon," he said hopelessly. His eyes were moist and he could not meet her gaze. She was full of exultation. "They have advised me to put myself under your protection, shameless as that might seem to a man. You and you alone have the power to protect me if I pass into the walls of Ganlook." "I?" she cried, all aflutter. "I could not thrust my head into the jaws of death unless the Princess of Graustark were there to stay the fury. Your royal hand alone can turn aside the inevitable. Alas, I'm helpless, and I know not what to do." Beverly Calhoun sat very straight and silent next to the misguided Baldos. After all, it was not within her power to protect him. She was not the princess, and she had absolutely no influence in Ganlook. The authorities there could not be deceived, as had been the ignorant hillmen. If she led him into the city, it was probable that she might be leading him to his death. She could only petition. She couldn't command. Once at Yetiv's side, she was confident that she could save the man who had done so much for her, but Ganlook was many miles from Edelweiss, and there was no assurance that intervention could be obtained in time. On the other hand, if he went back to the hills, he was likely to die of his fever. Beverly was in a most unhappy state of mind. If she confessed that she was not the princess, he would refuse to enter the gates of Ganlook, and he would be perfectly justified in doing so. But if I should fail?" she said at last, a shiver rushing over her. "You are the only hope, Your Highness. You had better say farewell to Baldos, and let him again seek the friendly valley," he said with a weary smile. "We can go no further. The soldiers must be near, Your Highness. If it means capture, we will go on. I cannot expose my friend to the dangers, though. Let me be put out here, and you drive on to safety. I will fare much better than you think, for I am young and strong and—" "No!" she cried. "I'll risk it. You must go into the city. Tell them so, and say that I will protect you with my own life and honor." Fear made him submissive. Her eyes gave him confidence, and her voice soothed his fear, if he possessed any. Leaning out of the window, he called to his men. Beverly looked on in wonder as these strange men bade farewell to their leader. Many of them were weeping. Most of them kissed his hand. There were broken sentences, tear-choked promises, anxious inquiries, and then the parting was over. "Where are they going?" Beverly whispered as they moved off into the dusk. "Back into the mountains to starve, poor fellows. God be kind to them. God be good to them," he half sobbed, his chin drooping. He was shaking like a leaf. Starve? She said. Have they no money? We're penniless, came in muffled tones from the stricken leader. Beverly leaned out of the window and she called to the departing ones. Ravone and one of the others reluctantly approached. Without a word, she opened a small traveling bag and pulled out a heavy purse. This she pressed into the hand of the nearest man. It was filled with Graustark gravos, for which she had exchanged her American gold back in Russia. God be with you, she fervently cried. The man kissed her hand, and they stood aside to let the coach roll into the dusky shadows that separated them from the gates of Ganlook, with old Franz still driving, the only one of the company left to serve as leader till the bitter end. Well, we've left them, said Baldos. I may never see them again. Never see them again. God, they've been so good. I will send for them the minute I get to Ganlook, and I promise pardons for all of them, cried Beverly. No, he told her. You are not to disturb them. It's better that they starve. Beverly was subdued. As they drew near the city gates, her heart began to fail her. This man's life was in her weak, incapable hands, and the time was nearing when she must stand between him and disaster. Where are those vaulted soldiers of yours? He suddenly said, irony in his voice. My soldiers? Isn't it rather unusual that in times of trouble and uncertainty, we should be able to approach within a mile of one of your most important cities without even so much as seeing a soldier of Graustark? Beverly felt that he was teasing, but it mattered not at all to her. That is a bit odd, isn't it? She agreed. Worse than that, Your Highness. Well, I shall speak to Dangloss about it, she told him serenely, and he looked up in surprise. Truly, he thought, she was the most extraordinary princess. Fully 3/4 of an hour passed before the coach was checked. Beverly, looking from the window, had seen the lighted windows of cottages growing closer and closer together. The barking of roadside dogs was the only sound that could be heard above the rattling of the wheels. It was too dark inside the coach to see the face of the man beside her, but something told Beverly that he was staring intently into the night, alert and anxious. The responsibility of her position swooped down on her like an avalanche as she thought of what the next few minutes were to bring. It was the sudden stopping of the coach and the sharp commands from outside that told her her probation was at an end. She could no longer speculate. It was time to act. The outpost, said Baldos in a strange voice. Perhaps they won't know us. I mean you, said Beverly. Baron Dangloss knows everyone, said Baldos bitterly. What a horrid old busybody Beverly started to say, but then she thought better. A couple of lanterns flashed at the window, almost blinding her. Aunt Fanny groaned loudly, but the figure of Baldos seemed to stiffen with defiance. Uniformed men peered into the interior with more rudeness and curiosity than seemed respectful to a princess, to say the least. They saw a pretty, pleading face with wide gray eyes and parted lips, but they did not bow in humble submission as Baldos expected. One of the men, evidently in command, addressed Beverly in rough but polite tones. It was a question that he asked. That Beverly knew, but she couldn't answer him, for she didn't understand him. What do you want? She said in English, with a creditable display of dignity. He does not speak English, Your Highness, said Baldos, in a voice so well disguised that it startled her. The officer just stared blankly. Every officer in my army should learn and must learn to speak English, she said. I decline to be questioned by that man. Will you talk to him in my stead? I, your highness, said Baldos. Yes. Tell him who we are and ask where the hospital is. But I don't speak your language yet well, said Baldos. Oh, you speak it beautifully, she said with a smile. Baldos leaned forward painfully, and he spoke to the officer in the Graustark tongue. Don't you know your princess? He demanded a bit harshly. The man's eyes flew wide open, and his jaw dropped. The princess? He gasped. Don't you stare like that, sir. Direct us to the main gate at once, or you will have cause to regret your slowness. But the princess is coming by the northern pass, the man mumbled. The guard has gone out to meet her, and Baldos cut the man off with the information that the princess, as he could see, had come by the lower pass, and that she was eager to reach a resting place at once. The convincing tone of the speaker and the regal indifference of the lady had its effect upon the officer, who had never seen her highness. He fell back with a deep obeisance, and he gave a few bewildered commands to his men. The coach moved off, attended by a party of foot soldiers, and Beverly heaved a sigh of relief. You did that beautifully, she whispered to Baldos, and he was considerably puzzled by the ardor of her praise. Where are we going now? Into the city, your highness, he answered. It was beginning to dawn on him that she was amazingly ignorant and inconsequential for one who enjoyed the right to command these common soldiers. Her old trepidation returned at his brief answer. Something told her that he might be beginning to mistrust her finally. After all, it meant everything to him, and so little to her. When the coach halted before the city gates, she was in a dire state of unhappiness. In the darkness, she could feel the reproachful eyes of Aunt Fanny searching for Beverly's abandoned conscience. Ask if Baron Dangloss is in Ganlook, and if he is, command them to take me to him immediately, said Beverly, a sudden inspiration seizing her. She would put the entire matter before the great chief of police and trust to fortune. Her hand fell impulsively on Baldos's, and to her amazement, his hand was cold as ice. What's the matter? She cried. You trusted me in the wilderness, your highness, he told her. I'm trusting you now. Before she could reply, the officer in charge of the Ganlook Gates appeared at the coach's window. There were lights all around, and Beverly's heart sank like lead. It would be a miracle if she made it through the gates unrecognized. I must see Baron Dangloss at once, she cried in English, utterly disdaining what she had previously told Baldos. The Baron is engaged right now, and you cannot see him, said the good-looking young officer in broken English. Where is he? Said Beverly. He is at the home of Colonel Goes, the commandant. What is your business with him? It's with him, and not with you, good sir, she said, imperious once more. You will conduct me to him immediately. You cannot enter the gate unless you... Insolence, said Baldos. Is this the way, sir, in which you address the princess? Make way for her. The princess? Said the officer. Then a strange smile overspread his face. He had served 3 years in the castle guard at Edelweiss. There was a long pause, fraught with disaster for Beverly, then yes, perhaps it is just as well that we take her to Baron Dangloss, he said. The deep meaning in his voice appealed only to the unhappy girl. There will be no further delay, Your Highness, he said mockingly. A moment later, the gates swung open and they passed through. Beverly and Lone knew that they were going to Baron Dangloss under heavy guard, virtually prisoners. The man, the guard, knew her to be an imposter, and he was doing his duty. There were smiles of derision on the faces of the soldiers when Beverly swept proudly between the files and up the steps leading to the commandant's door, but there were no audible remarks. Baldos followed, walking painfully but defiantly, and Aunt Fanny came at the end with a handbag. The guards grinned as Aunt Fanny waddled up the steps. The young officer and two men entered the door with the wayfarers, who were ordered to halt in the hallway. "Will your Highness come with me?" said the officer, coming back to the hall after a short absence. There was unmistakable derision in his voice and a palpable insolence in his manner. Beverly flushed angrily. "Baron Dangloss is very curious to see you," said the man with a smile. Nonetheless, he did shrink back a bit beneath the cold gleam in the eyes of Beverly. "You will remain here," said Beverly, turning to Baldos and Aunt Fanny, "and you will have nothing whatsoever to say to this very important young man." The important young man actually chuckled. "Follow me, Your Most Royal Highness," he told her, proceeding through the door that opened into the office of the commandant. Baldos glared after them angrily. "Young man," said Beverly, "someday, and someday soon, you will be a much wiser soldier and in the ranks," Beverly told him. The mocking smile instantly receded from his insolent face, for there seemed to be a word of prophecy in the way Beverly spoke. Somehow, he was in a much more respectful mood when he returned to the hall and stood in the presence of the tall, flushed stranger in his raggedy uniform. A short, fierce little man in the picturesque uniform of a Graustark officer rose as Beverly entered the other office. His short beard bristled as though it were concealing a smile, but his manner was polite, even deferential. She advanced fearlessly towards him, a wayward smile straggling onto her face. "I dare say that you know I'm not the princess," she told him with composure. Every bit of fear was gone now that she had reached the line of the battle. The doughty baron looked a bit surprised at this frank way of opening an interview. "I am very well aware of that," he told her. "They say that you know everyone, Baron Dangloss," said Beverly. "So tell me, who am I?" This powerful man looked at the smiling face for a moment, his bushy eyebrows contracting ever so slightly. There was a shameless streak of dust across her cheek, but there was also a dimple that appeared to the grim old man. His eyes twinkled, and he replied, "You are Miss Beverly Calhoun of Washington." And that is where the chapter ends. So the jig is up, but we're barely a quarter of the way into the book. So that tells me that the jig might not be up. I guess we're going to have to wait and see. I guess we're going to get a whole lot more political intrigue and things. Interesting. I don't know. This definitely it doesn't feel like something that was written way back in the turn of the last century. Like it almost feels like it should be a YA, like, teen romance novel, or maybe fan fiction. I don't know what it would be fan fiction of, though. But yeah, it's surprising to me that this was the style of writing back then, especially coming off the back of like Pride and Prejudice and Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein, which were much more atmospheric. And maybe that's just a difference between an American writer and a European writer. That might be the difference. I don't know. Let me know what you think down below in the comments. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that chapter. And yeah, I'll see you tomorrow.